She found out she was carrying his child and his engagement announcement on the same morning. The ultrasound photo was still warm in her hand when his face appeared on the television screen. Alexander Whitmore, Chicago's most feared man, standing beside a woman Clara had never seen. A diamond ring confirmed what no one had bothered to tell her. 4 months. She had given him 4 months of her life, her body, her silence, and he had given her nothing but beautiful lies wrapped in expensive sheets. If you've ever loved someone who kept you hidden, this story is for you. Subscribe to the channel, hit like, and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next will change everything. But the painting arrived on a Tuesday. Clara Bennett had been working in the back room of the Chicago Art Institute's conservation wing for 6 hours straight when her assistant knocked and told her the piece was here. A mid-19th century oil on canvas, provenance unclear, surface damage extensive, the kind of work most conservators would look at and quietly recommend deaccessioning. Clara looked at it for 40 seconds and told her assistant to clear her afternoon schedule. She pressed her fingertips along the upper right quadrant of the canvas, not touching, just hovering, reading the texture through the air the way a doctor might read a pulse. Beneath 3 layers of yellowed varnish and at least 2 crude restoration attempts by someone who clearly had no business near a paintbrush, she could feel the original work. Not literally, but she knew. She always knew. That was the thing about Clara. She saw what was underneath. It was also, she would later understand, the thing that destroyed her. She met Alexander Whitmore at a private acquisition event in October, in a room full of men who wore their money the way other men wore cologne. Too much of it, applied to cover something worse. He was standing in front of a Hopper reproduction, which struck her as odd because everything else in the room was original, and she said so before she thought better of it. She said, "That one's a copy." And he turned and looked at her the way people rarely looked at Clara Bennett, like she had said something interesting. He was tall. Not remarkable in the way wealth sometimes manufactures tallness, with the posture and the suits and the deliberate slowness of movement, just physically large in the way that suggested his body had been built by something other than a personal trainer. His jaw was sharp. His eyes were the particular gray of a sky that hasn't decided yet whether it's going to storm. He said, "I know. I put it there." She said, "Why?" He said, "To see who notices." She should have walked away. She had a glass of white wine in her hand and a professional obligation to be pleasant and a personal rule about men at events like this, which was simply that she didn't. She had learned that rule slowly and at some cost, the way most useful rules are learned. She didn't walk away. That was October. By November, she was spending 3 nights a week in his penthouse on the 54th floor of a building in River North that didn't have his name on it, but was absolutely his. She figured that out by the 3rd visit, the way certain details accumulate into a picture if you're paying attention. The security on the elevator. The men who stood near doorways but never explained why. The phone calls he took in other rooms that didn't last long but seemed to cost him something. She didn't ask. That was her second mistake. She was 31 years old and careful and self-sufficient, and she had a studio apartment in Wicker Park that she'd furnished herself over 6 years with pieces she'd found and restored, and a cat named after a 19th century forger, and a reputation at the Institute that she'd built from nothing. She didn't need Alexander Whitmore. She knew that. She kept telling herself that. The way you tell yourself something, you're no longer sure you believe. By December, she was staying 5 nights a week. By January, she'd stopped counting. He was not an easy man to be with. He was quiet in ways that felt like walls. He made decisions without consulting her because it genuinely didn't occur to him that consultation was something a person might want. He controlled the temperature in the penthouse at 68 degrees regardless of season because that was what he'd decided, and he ate dinner at 7:30 because that was when he ate dinner, and he slept on the left side of the bed, always. And she was expected to understand these things without being told. She understood them because she was observant by training, and because underneath all of it, underneath the silence and the control and the life he lived that she was only allowed to see a portion of, she felt something from him that she did not feel from most people. He paid attention to her, not to what she looked like, though he was clearly interested in that. Not to her professionally, though he respected her work in the specific way that men with power sometimes respect competence in others. He paid attention to her. When she was tired, he noticed before she said so. When something at work bothered her, he asked the right question. When she talked about a restoration project, he listened without performing interest. He actually listened, asked follow-up questions 3 days later, remembered what she'd said. For a woman who had spent most of her adult life being overlooked in rooms, that attention felt like sunlight. It was embarrassing how much it meant. She knew it was embarrassing, and she felt it anyway. She told herself it was enough. That whatever he kept in those other rooms, whatever calls he took in that low voice that carried no warmth at all, whatever the men near the doorways were for, it was separate. She was separate from that. She was the part of his life that was clean. She found out in February that she was pregnant. She was alone in the conservation lab when the second line appeared, and she sat very still for approximately 4 minutes looking at the test on the steel work table beside her magnification equipment and a half-restored Flemish still life. And she thought, I should call someone. She didn't call anyone. She drove home, poured herself a glass of water she didn't drink, and sat on her kitchen floor with her back against the cabinets because the floor felt like the most honest place in the apartment. She was 8 weeks. She'd missed the signs because she'd been absorbed in a difficult piece, a landscape with concealed structural damage that had required her full concentration. And because she had been, she now admitted to herself, working very hard not to think too carefully about her life. She was not unhappy about the pregnancy. That surprised her. She examined the feeling carefully, the way she examined everything, and found that beneath the shock and the fear and the very large and legitimate concern about the man whose child this was and what his life actually consisted of, there was something quieter. Something that felt terrifyingly like want. She decided she would tell Alexander that morning. She would go to the penthouse, she would make breakfast. She'd done it dozens of times. She knew the kitchen the way she knew her own, and she would tell him. She arrived at 7:15. The security man in the lobby, Marcus, waved her through with the familiar nod. The elevator required a key card she'd had since November. The penthouse was quiet when she entered. The city spread out below the floor-to-ceiling windows in the particular gray-blue of a Chicago February morning. She started breakfast: eggs, toast, coffee. The domestic simplicity of it settled her nerves slightly. She had a speech prepared. Not a speech. She didn't do speeches, but a sequence of sentences she'd arranged in the car, the way she arranged a plan of treatment before beginning a restoration. Step 1. Step 2. She reached over to turn on the small television mounted under the kitchen cabinets. She turned it on for background noise. The image that appeared was Alexander. He was standing on the steps of a building she recognized as the Harrington Group's North Shore estate. She'd seen it in architectural publications, a limestone monstrosity that cost more than some small countries. He was wearing the charcoal suit she recognized, the one that fit him across the shoulders in a way that had once made her lose track of a sentence she was speaking. He was standing beside a woman Clara had never seen, dark-haired, composed, beautiful in the specific way of women who have been beautiful their entire lives, and expect the world to arrange itself accordingly. The news Chiron read, Whitmore-Harrington engagement confirmed. Chicago's 2 most powerful families to unite in spring ceremony. Clara stood at the stove and watched the segment for its full 2 minutes and 40 seconds. The reporter discussed the alliance with the particular reverence journalists use when speaking about people they fear. The woman beside Alexander, Victoria Harrington, the Chiron confirmed, daughter of Richard Harrington, did not look at him with love. She looked at him with something more complicated than that, something that Clara, who was very good at reading surfaces, could not entirely decode. Alexander in the footage looked at nothing. He looked exactly this way he always looked in public, like the concept of other people's perception was faintly beneath his attention. The eggs were burning. Clara turned off the burner. She stood in his kitchen in the penthouse where she'd spent more nights than in her own apartment over the past 4 months, holding a spatula, and felt the floor shift beneath her the way it does in the first second of an earthquake before you know whether it's going to stop. She set the spatula down. She walked to the bedroom and looked at the space she'd been occupying for months. The drawer he'd cleared for her things, the books on the nightstand, the reading glasses she'd left on his side of the bed because the light was better there. She walked back to the kitchen. Her purse was on the counter. Inside her purse was the ultrasound photograph. She'd carried it since yesterday, intending to show him this morning. She took it out and held it under the kitchen light, the small, blurred shape that the technician had pointed to with the particular gentleness of someone delivering information that will matter for a long time. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned on the gas burner, held the photograph at the corner, and watched it catch. She let it burn down to her fingertips before she dropped it in the sink. She opened the drawer he'd given her and took nothing from it. She left the books on the nightstand. She left the reading glasses. She left the earrings on the ceramic dish on the bathroom counter. He'd given them to her in December, and she'd loved them, and she left them because taking them would mean she'd accepted something from him, and she was no longer willing to have accepted things from him. She wrote nothing. There was nothing to write that would be adequate, and she wasn't interested in adequate. She picked up her purse and her coat. She left her phone on the kitchen counter because her phone was connected to her life, and her life could be tracked, and she was no longer willing to be tracked. She would buy another one. She would buy a cheap one in cash, and she would call her sister in Michigan, and she would begin the process of becoming someone who had never been here. She took the elevator down. She nodded to Marcus in the lobby because Marcus had never done anything to her. She walked out into the February cold and turned north and kept walking until she reached the L stop at Chicago Avenue, and she stood on the platform in the wind with her arms crossed over her chest, over the place where something 8 weeks old was already insisting on existing, and she waited for the train. She did not cry on the platform. She did not cry on the train. She cried in the bathroom of a diner on Milwaukee Avenue where she stopped to drink coffee she needed because she hadn't eaten breakfast, and she cried with the water running so the sound was covered. And when she was finished, she washed her face with cold water and looked at herself in the mirror above the sink. She looked the same. That felt wrong somehow, that she looked the same. She had her wallet. She had her professional credentials. She had a sister in Michigan she hadn't called enough, and a skill set that was highly specialized and transferable, and a child growing inside her that she had already, in the space of 12 hours, decided she was going to keep. She left the diner. She did not go back to her apartment. She understood, in the clear-eyed way that shock sometimes produces, that her apartment was connected to her and therefore connected to him, and she did not know the full extent of what connected meant in his world. She went to her colleague Dana's apartment in Logan Square and told Dana she needed 3 days, and Dana, who had seen Clara through 2 bad situations in the past and knew not to ask before being asked, said okay and handed her a spare key. In the days that followed, Clara dismantled herself with the same methodical care she brought to the most delicate restoration work. She called the Institute and arranged an extended leave. A family matter, she said, and it was true enough. She arranged to have her belongings moved from her Wicker Park apartment to a storage unit. She closed her bank accounts and opened new ones at a different institution, one that didn't share any of the data networks she knew certain powerful people in this city could access. She bought the cheap phone and called her sister and gave her a number she promised to check. Then she found the town. Millhaven, Illinois. Population 4,000 and change, 80 miles southwest of Chicago. It had a main street and a grain elevator visible from most of the town, and a commercial space available for rent at a price that matched what she could manage on her savings while her leave paid out. It was a place where a woman arriving with no history would be notable for approximately 6 weeks and then simply absorbed. She arrived on a Thursday in late February, driving a used car she'd paid cash for, with 2 bags and a box of books, and the particular determination of a person who has decided that their survival depends on being unremarkable. She rented the commercial space and the apartment above it. She opened a bakery. She had learned to bake from her grandmother and had continued it quietly for years as the thing she did that had nothing to do with work. She was good at it. Precision helped. Patience helped. The ability to read a process and understand where the variables were and control for them. That helped too. Within 3 weeks, she had regulars. Within 6 weeks, she was making enough to cover her costs. Within 8 weeks, Millhaven had absorbed Clara Bennett the way small towns absorb people who are quiet and capable and don't ask for more than they need. She did not think about Alexander Whitmore. That was not true. She thought about him every day with the specific, deliberate restraint of someone managing chronic pain, acknowledging it, refusing to let it expand, going on. She thought about the way he'd listened to her. She thought about the gray eyes and the 68-degree apartment and the calls in the other room. She thought about what she should have asked and didn't. She thought sometimes at 3 in the morning when the baby moved and the bakery below was dark and quiet about whether any part of it had been real. She decided it didn't matter. Real or not, she had not been chosen. She had been hidden. And Clara Bennett, she had understood this about herself only after she left, could survive almost anything except being someone's secret. The baby was due in May. By April, Clara was 8 months along, and the bakery was open 6 days a week, and she had learned the names of most of the 4,000 people in Millhaven, and she thought most days that she had made it. She was behind the counter on a Wednesday morning in the second week of April, lifting a tray of morning rolls, when the bell above the door rang. She turned, expecting Marge Calloway, who came every Wednesday at 8:15 for 2 cinnamon rolls and a medium coffee, and always held the door open too long. The doorway was filled by a man in a dark coat. He was too large for the doorway. He had always been too large for most spaces. His hair was slightly longer than she remembered, as if he'd stopped attending to certain things. His gray eyes found her immediately, the way they always had, with that quality of absolute focus that she'd once found remarkable and now understood was simply how Alexander Whitmore moved through the world, measuring, cataloging, deciding. He looked at her. He looked at the evidence of 8 months that she was carrying with the specific weight of the 3rd trimester, low and heavy and unmistakable. His face, that face that she had studied for 4 months and learned the way she learned a damaged canvas, did something she had never seen it do. It broke. Just for a second. Just a fracture across the composure, a single moment of something raw and uncontrolled before the walls came back up. But she saw it. She saw it because she was trained to see what was underneath, and because she knew this face the way she knew her own work. He stepped inside. The door fell closed behind him. He said her name. Just that. Just Clara. The bakery was warm. She could smell the morning rolls. Outside on Main Street, Millhaven was doing its ordinary Wednesday morning, entirely unaware that the most dangerous man in Chicago had just walked through her door. Clara set the tray down carefully so she didn't drop it. She looked at him across the counter. She said, "How?" He said, "It took me 6 weeks to find a cash car purchase in the right time frame. 11 weeks to find the storage unit. 14 weeks to find you. 14 weeks. She had been here for 14 weeks and he had spent all 14 of them looking. Something moved in her chest that she refused to name. She said, "You need to leave." He said, "Clara." She said, "You need to leave right now, Alexander, or I will call every person in this town and they will come, and you do not want a scene in a town this small." He didn't move. He stood in the middle of her bakery and looked at her. Looked at all of her, at the evidence of everything she'd been carrying alone, and something in his expression was so far from the controlled, deliberate man she'd known that for a moment she didn't recognize him. He said, very quietly, "Is the baby mine?" The question was not what she'd expected. She'd expected commands. She'd expected the machinery of his world, the pressure, the resources deployed to produce compliance. She had not expected that voice, that particular rawness. She said, "Yes." The word hit him. She watched it hit him, watched the gray eyes close for just a moment. When he opened them, he looked at her and said, "I'm not leaving Millhaven." Clara's hands were steady on the counter. The baby shifted inside her, a slow, rolling movement that she had learned to read the way she read everything. She said, "Then we need to talk." He nodded. But before she could say another word, her phone, the cheap phone, the untraceable phone, the number she'd given to no one except her sister and Dana, rang. She looked at the screen. The number was blocked. She answered. The voice on the other end was a woman's, controlled, careful, and absolutely terrified. The voice said, "Ms. Bennett, my name is Victoria Harrington. I need you to listen to me very carefully, because both of our lives may depend on it." Clara did not put this phone on speaker. That was the first decision, and she made it in the half second between the second ring and her thumb hitting the answer button. Made it without looking at Alexander, which was its own kind of statement. She turned slightly away from the counter, toward the window that looked out on Main Street, where a man she recognized as Bill Pruitt was walking his arthritic beagle past the hardware store in the ordinary way of a Wednesday morning in a town that had nothing to do with any of this. She said, "I'm listening." Victoria Harrington's voice was not what she'd expected. Clara had seen the woman on television for 2 minutes and 40 seconds in February, standing beside Alexander on those limestone steps, and had constructed from that image a particular kind of woman, composed, cold, accustomed to silence as a power tool. The voice on the phone was composed, yes, but beneath the composure was something shaking. Victoria said, "I know you left Chicago in February. I know why. I'm not calling to bring you back. I'm calling because my father knows about your pregnancy, and he has made a decision about it that you need to understand before it becomes something you can't stop." Clara said, "How do you know about my pregnancy?" Victoria said, "My father has people inside Alexander's household. He's had them for 2 years. He knows everything that happened between you and Alexander. He knows the timeline. He knows what you're carrying." Clara's eyes moved to Alexander, who was standing exactly where she'd left him, watching her face with that absolute attention. He couldn't hear the other end of the call. He was reading her expression instead, which was almost the same thing. She said, "What decision?" Victoria said, "He plans to use the child as leverage, not against you, against Alexander. An illegitimate heir from a hidden relationship destabilizes the alliance my father spent 3 years constructing. He cannot allow that child to have any legal claim to the Whitmore name or the Whitmore organization. He has a lawyer prepared. He has a federal contact prepared. He intends to move within the next 30 days. The bakery was warm. The morning rolls were cooling on the rack. Outside, Bill Pruitt's beagle had stopped walking and was investigating something in the gutter with the focused dedication of a creature that had nowhere to be. Clara said, "What does he intend to do?" A pause. The kind of pause that precedes something bad. Victoria said, "He intends to have you declared an extortion risk. A woman who became pregnant deliberately to extract money from a public figure. He has documentation prepared, fabricated documentation, but prepared by people who are very good at preparation. He intends to file it simultaneously with the federal contacts investigation into Alexander's organization. The investigation is real. The prosecutor is named Daniel Voss. He and my father have been building the case for 14 months. Clara stood very still. She said, "Why are you telling me this?" Another pause. Different quality. Something more personal in it. Victoria said, "Because I'm tired. Because I have spent 28 years being a piece my father moves around a board, and I have decided, recently, and at some cost to myself, that I am done being moved. And because the thing he is planning to do to you and your child is something I will not be a part of. Whatever else I am not that." Clara looked at the phone in her hand. She looked at Alexander. He was watching her with the stillness of a man who has learned that stillness is its own kind of preparation. She said into the phone, "Where are you?" Victoria said, "Chicago. I can be in Millhaven by 2 o'clock if you'll see me." Clara said, "Come alone." She ended the call. The bakery was very quiet. The heating system made a low sound through the vents. From somewhere in the back, the timer on the second oven was counting down. Alexander said, "Who was that?" Clara put the phone in her apron pocket. She looked at him directly, and what she felt looking at him, the specific compound of anger and grief, and something she had not successfully killed in 14 weeks of trying. She let herself feel it without letting it move her face. She said, "Victoria Harrington." The stillness in him changed quality. Not movement, just a different kind of still. He said, "How does she have this number?" Clara said, "I don't know, but she's coming here at 2 o'clock and I am going to talk to her, and you are going to sit down somewhere and not make decisions until I've heard what she has to say." Alexander said, "Clara?" She said, "Sit down, Alexander." He sat down. It was one of the 3 tables she'd put in the front of the bakery. Small, round, the kind she'd found at an estate sale in Kankakee and sanded and refinished herself. He was too large for the chair. He sat in it anyway, and she looked at him sitting in the small chair in his expensive coat in her bakery in Millhaven, Illinois. And the absurdity of it was so complete that for a moment she felt something crack open in her chest that was almost laughter and was absolutely not. She said, "I'm going to make coffee. You're going to drink it, and you're going to tell me everything you did not tell me in 4 months. And then Victoria Harrington is going to tell me what she came to tell me. And then I am going to decide what I do next. Not you, me." He said, "Understood." She made the coffee. She made it behind the counter with her back to him for most of the process. And in those minutes, she did the thing she had been doing for 14 weeks. She organized the information into a sequence she could work with. Victoria Harrington was terrified. Victoria's father had known about the pregnancy. There was a federal investigation. There was a prosecutor named Daniel Voss. There was fabricated documentation being prepared against her, against her child. The coffee finished. She poured 2 cups and carried them to the table and sat across from him for the first time since October, and she felt the strangeness of it. How familiar his face was. How completely she had memorized it without meaning to. How much it cost her to look at it. She said, "Tell me what you didn't tell me." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. His hands were large, and she remembered them, and she looked at them once and looked away. He said, "The organization has operated in Chicago for 31 years. My father built it. I took it over at 26 when he had his first stroke. We work in construction, shipping, 4 legitimate businesses, and the parts that are not legitimate, which I will not describe in detail, but which you have probably already understood." She said, "I understood more than you thought I did." He said, "I know that now." She said, "The Harrington engagement." He said, "It was arranged 16 months ago, before you. It was a political arrangement between my father, before he died, and Richard Harrington, a consolidation of interests on the North Shore. I agreed to it because it was the rational decision for the organization." She said, "And then you met me." He said, "And then I met you." She said, "And you didn't tell me." He said, "No." She said, "Why?" He looked at her. He didn't look away, and he didn't offer her the comfortable version. He said, "Because I didn't want to lose what we had while I figured out what to do with it. Because I had never had something I didn't want to calculate, and I didn't know what to do with that. Because I was a coward about the specific thing that required courage." The word coward came out of him with the difficulty of something he'd arrived at slowly and didn't enjoy. She said, "Do you understand what that cost me?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Not the engagement, not the television. The morning, Alexander. I was in your kitchen making you breakfast with an ultrasound photograph in my purse, and I turned on the television for background noise." Something moved across his face. She said, "I burned it in your sink." He said, and his voice was lower, "I know. I found the ash." She said, "Did you know I was pregnant before I left?" He said, "No. I found out 6 weeks later through a source I will not identify. It changed the nature of the search." She said, "You were already searching." He said, "I started looking the same day." She looked at him. She thought about 14 weeks. She thought about the cash car purchase and the storage unit and the methodical tracking of her deliberate disappearance. She said, "That doesn't change what you did." He said, "No, it doesn't." She said, "And the engagement is still active." He said, "On paper. I have not ended it formally because ending it formally triggers contractual consequences with Richard Harrington that I was not prepared to manage until I found you." She said, "So I am still the secret." He said, "You were never Clara." She said, "I was in your life for 4 months and not one person in your world knew I existed. What do you call that?" He was quiet. She said, "What do you call that, Alexander?" He said, "A failure. I call it a failure. The worst one I've made." She stood up and went back behind the counter because she needed to be on the other side of something from him. She straightened the rolls on the rack even though they didn't need straightening. She looked out the window at Main Street. She said, not turning around, "I kept telling myself that what we had was real, that the way you listened was real, that the attention was real." He said, "It was real." She said, "Real things don't stay hidden." He said nothing. She turned around. She looked at him across the bakery. She said, "Oh, I am not going to pretend I don't still feel something. I would be lying and I don't lie, not even when the truth is inconvenient. But feeling something and making a decision based on it are 2 different things, And I am not the same woman I was in February. That woman let herself be hidden because she was grateful to be seen. I am done being grateful for less than I deserve. He said, I know. She said, then you know that if you want any part of what comes next, any part of this child's life, any part of mine, the terms are mine, not yours. Mine. He said, yes. She said, I mean it. He said, Clara, I have spent 14 weeks looking for you in a city that didn't want me to find you. I'm sitting in a chair that is too small for me in a bakery in Millhaven, Illinois, drinking coffee I didn't ask for. I'm not here to negotiate terms that favor me. I am here because I need to be here. And I understand completely, that understanding comes about 14 weeks too late. She looked at him for a long moment. The timer on the second oven went off. She went and pulled the tray and set it on the cooling rack, and neither of them spoke for the minute it took to do that. And the silence was not comfortable, but it was honest, which was more than they'd ever quite managed before. At 1:58, a car Clara didn't recognize parked on Main Street outside the bakery window. A woman got out. She was as composed in person as she'd looked on television, but she moved differently, quickly, with the precision of someone who has made a decision and is executing it before she can think better of it. She was wearing a dark coat, no jewelry except small earrings. She looked up at the bakery sign and then came in. She stopped when she saw Alexander. The two of them looked at each other across the small room with the particular expression of people who have shared a public arrangement and are meeting now in a context that is entirely outside its terms. It was not hostile. It was not warm. It was complicated in a way that Clara, watching, could see the whole shape of two people who had been placed beside each other, like pieces on a board, and had both understood, at different points, and for different reasons, that they wanted off the board. Victoria said, Alexander. Alexander said, Victoria. Then Victoria looked at Clara. She looked at all of her, the way Alexander had that morning, and her expression was different from Alexander's. Not the raw fracture, but something more private, something almost like recognition. She said, Thank you for seeing me. Clara said, Sit down. Talk. Victoria sat. She set her bag on the floor and folded her hands on the table with the deliberate arrangement of someone who uses physical order to manage internal disorder. She looked at both of them. She said, My father has been planning this for 2 years. The engagement was never about alliance. I want you both to understand that from the beginning, because everything else flows from it. Alexander said, Explain. Victoria said, He approached your father's people 16 months ago with the merger proposal. The legitimate businesses, the North Shore interests, the political connections, he laid it out as a consolidation. Your people ran their due diligence. It looked clean because he made it look clean. What the due diligence didn't find was what he'd already been building on the other side. She reached into her bag and produced a flash drive. She set it on the table. She said, 14 months of communication between my father and Daniel Voss. Voss is a federal prosecutor in the Northern District. He and my father have been coordinating an investigation designed to dismantle the Whitmore organization entirely. Not prosecute it, dismantle it. The distinction matters. Prosecution leaves assets. Dismantling, done the way Voss intends to do it, leaves nothing. Alexander looked at the flash drive. He did not touch it. He said, Your father approached me with a merger while simultaneously building a federal case against my organization. Victoria said, Yes. He said, The wedding was the trigger point. Victoria said, Once the ceremony was legally complete, he would file. The investigation was structured so that the marriage would appear to implicate Whitmore family assets in Harrington family crimes. Your organization would be frozen pending investigation. Voss would use that window to work through the asset seizures. By the time the legal process sorted itself out, there would be nothing left to sort. The bakery was very quiet. Alexander said, And my people inside the Harrington household. Victoria said, He found them 8 months ago. He's been feeding them information he wanted you to have. You think you have visibility into his operation. You have visibility into what he chose to show you. Alexander said nothing. His jaw was tight in the specific way that meant he was processing something that had hit him below the waterline. Victoria said, And then there's Ms. Bennett. She looked at Clara. She said, "When my father discovered the pregnancy, through the household source, he added a secondary component to the plan. He has prepared documentation through a lawyer named Graves, who operates in the gray area between civil fraud and outright fabrication. The documents characterize you as a deliberate extortion attempt. A woman who cultivated a relationship with a public figure with the intention of becoming pregnant and leveraging the resulting child for financial settlement." Claire said, "That's a lie." Victoria said, "Yes. It is a complete lie, and it is very well constructed, and it is scheduled to be filed with 2 different civil courts and leaked to 3 media organizations simultaneously with the federal action. The purpose is twofold. It damages Alexander's reputation at the precise moment his organization is under federal scrutiny, and it ensures that any claim you make regarding the child's paternity is pre-contaminated in the public record." Claire's hands, flat on the table, were steady. She made them stay steady. She said, "He wants to destroy any legal standing my child might have." Victoria said, "He wants to eliminate any future claim on the Whitmore legacy. He thinks of it as risk management." The word landed in the room and stayed there. Alexander's voice, when he spoke, was very quiet and had a quality in it that Clara had not heard before. Not anger, which she had seen versions of, but something underneath anger, something more fundamental and far more dangerous. He said, "He plans to move against a child." Victoria said, "Yes." Alexander said, "Within 30 days. Victoria said, "The timeline I have is closer to 18 days. He moved it forward after a report from his source suggested you might have located Ms. Bennett." Clara looked at Alexander. He was looking at the flash drive on the table, and what was happening behind his eyes, she could read the way she read everything. Not completely, but enough. The calculation she was watching was not about power or retaliation or any of the things she might have expected. It was about the 18-day window and the child and the woman sitting across from him who had spent 14 weeks disappearing from his world. He looked up at her. He said, "Clara, I need to tell you what I'm thinking, and I need you to tell me if you can accept it." She said, "Then tell me." He said, "I cannot end this from Millhaven. The evidence on that drive needs to be verified, and then used in a way that closes every door he has opened simultaneously. The federal contact, the civil filing, the media leak, the household sources. If any one piece survives, it reconstitutes. I know how to do that. I have done it before. But I cannot do it alone, and I cannot do it without resources I don't have access to from here." She said, "You want to go back to Chicago?" He said, "I want us to go back to Chicago." She said, "That is not a small thing you're asking." He said, "I know." She said, "You're asking me to walk into the center of your world, the world you kept me out of for 4 months." He said, "Yes, but not as something I'm protecting, as someone I need." She looked at him. She looked at Victoria, who was watching this exchange with the expression of someone who has stopped pretending that what was happening in this room was not genuinely, privately moving to her. Clara said, "If I go back on my terms. Not as your secret, not as the woman in the penthouse. I am in the room for every conversation. I see every document. I am told everything." He said, "Yes." She said, "And the engagement ends. Not eventually, immediately." He looked at Victoria. Victoria said with a very dry quality that was the closest thing to humor Clara had yet heard from her, "I will personally deliver the paperwork. I have had it prepared for 6 weeks. I was simply waiting for an occasion." Clara stood up. She looked at both of them. She said, "I need 20 minutes. There are things in this building that I need to arrange before I can leave it, and I am not going to rush them. You will wait here and you will not make any phone calls until I am back in this room." She went upstairs to the apartment above the bakery. She stood in the middle of it for a moment. The small bedroom with the good light she'd found first. The second-hand furniture she'd chosen. The evidence of 4 months of building something quiet and hers. She went to the closet and pulled out the bag she had never entirely unpacked, because some part of her, she now admitted, had always known this was temporary. She packed what she needed. She came back downstairs in 17 minutes with the bag over one shoulder and her coat and the cheap phone in her pocket. Both of them were where she'd left them. She said, All right, let's go. It was Alexander who opened the bakery door. As Clara stepped out into the April air of Main Street, the baby shifted, that slow, rolling certainty, and she put one hand briefly against her side, acknowledging it, and then dropped her hand and kept moving. They were halfway to the cars when Alexander's phone rang. He looked at the screen. His face went still in a way she had not seen before. Not the composure she knew, not the deliberate management of expression, a different kind of still, the kind that preceded something that could not be undergone. He answered. He listened for 11 seconds. He ended the call. Clara said, "What?" He said, "Richard Harrington moved the timeline again. He filed this morning. Both the federal referral and the civil documentation are already in the system." Victoria made a sound, short, involuntary. He said, "Voss issued a preliminary freeze order on Whitmore organizational accounts 40 minutes ago." Clara stood on the sidewalk in Mill Haven, Illinois, with her bag over her shoulder and her child shifting inside her, and the April wind coming down Main Street past the grain elevator she could see for most of the town, and she understood with complete clarity that the 18 days they'd thought they had were already gone. They had nothing but right now. She said, "Then we move right now." He said, "Clara, you should understand what you're walking into if we go back today. It's not safe, it's not contained, and I cannot guarantee—" She said, "Alexander." He stopped. She said, "I have spent 4 months being safe and contained in a town where nothing happens. Look where that got us." She walked to the car. They drove in 2 cars and said nothing into their phones for the first 40 miles. Clara drove the cash car she'd bought in February. The used Civic with the heater that worked on the driver's side only, and a crack in the passenger mirror she'd never gotten around to fixing. Alexander had wanted her in his car, a black sedan with tinted windows that belonged to a world she was deliberately not thinking too hard about yet. She'd said no. She needed to drive herself. He'd accepted that without argument, which told her something about how much had shifted in the past 4 hours. Victoria followed in her own car. 3 vehicles moving northeast on I-55 toward Chicago, toward whatever Richard Harrington had already put in motion. Clara drove with both hands on the wheel and the heat on full and the radio off. She did the thing she did with damaged work. She held what she knew in front of her and looked at its shape without flinching. The federal referral was filed. The civil documentation was in the system. The accounts were frozen. That meant Alexander's organization was already operating with one hand tied, already responding to something rather than initiating, which was the worst position for a man whose entire power structure depended on being the one who moved first. And Richard Harrington had done it on a Wednesday morning in April, while Alexander was sitting in a bakery in Mill Haven, drinking coffee he hadn't asked for. The timing was not accidental. She was certain of that. She thought about Victoria's voice on the phone, controlled and terrified and decided, all 3 at once. She thought about what it cost a person to turn against their own father, the specific weight of that, and she found she had more understanding for it than she might have expected. Her phone buzzed. Alexander's number. She answered on speaker. He said, "There's a property on the west side, Garfield Park. Not connected to anything registered under my name or the organization. Clean title through a holding company that predates my father's business. We go there first." She said, "Is it safe?" He said, "It's the safest thing I have right now." She said, "Is that a yes or a no?" A pause. He said, "It's a yes with qualifications." She said, "Tell me the qualifications." He said, "I have 3 people I trust completely. I'm calling them now. Everyone else in my organization is a variable until I understand how Harrington's source got as far inside as he did." She said, "You don't know who the source is." He said, "I have 2 candidates. I need an hour and access to certain records to narrow it down." She said, "Then narrow it down." She ended the call and drove. The Garfield Park property was a 3-flat brick building on a street that was not prosperous but was not derelict, the particular Chicago middle ground of blocks that have survived several cycles of neighborhood without committing to any particular version of themselves. There was a garage in the back that fit all 3 cars. There was a second-floor unit that had been kept clean and functional without looking like anyone lived there, which was its own kind of statement about how Alexander Whitmore moved through the world, maintaining places that didn't exist on paper for situations that couldn't be planned for. Clara walked through the unit once while Alexander made calls in the back room. 3 bedrooms, a kitchen with adequate supplies, windows that looked out on a courtyard. Clean, functional. Stripped of anything personal, which she found both appropriate and quietly depressing. Victoria stood at the kitchen window with her coat still on, watching the courtyard below. Clara said, "How long have you known about your father's plan?" Victoria said, "In pieces. The first piece was 11 months ago, a conversation I was not meant to hear between my father and a man I didn't recognize. They used a name I didn't know then. Boss. I filed it away. I kept filing things away until I had enough of the shape to understand what I was looking at." Clara said, "And then you waited." Victoria said, "I waited until I understood how to use what I knew without getting myself destroyed in the process." She paused. "I am not a brave person by nature. I want you to know that. What I am is very patient and extremely angry." Clara looked at her. She said, "That might be enough." One of Alexander's 3 trusted people arrived first. A woman named Sue, small and quick-moving, who came through the back entrance with a laptop bag and 2 phones still in their packaging, and looked at Clara without expression and said, "You're the conservator." Clara said, "Yes." Sue said, "He talked about you," which was apparently the full extent of what Sue intended to say about that. The second was a man named Garrett, who was large in the specific way that suggested structural load-bearing capacity rather than aggression, and who set up a monitoring station at the kitchen table with the focused efficiency of a person who has done this exact thing before. The third was a lawyer named Iris Chen, who arrived with a briefcase and reading glasses pushed up on her head and went immediately to the kitchen table and plugged in and said nothing to anyone for the first 20 minutes, which Clara recognized as the behavior of someone who processes information first and people second, a trait she respected. Alexander came out of the back room. He had taken off his coat. He was in the dark shirt underneath, sleeves pushed up, and he looked like he hadn't slept, which was probably true, which was probably her fault in the specific sense that he had been in a car driving to Millhaven since early morning. He looked at Iris. He said, "Civil filing first." Iris said without looking up, "Already reading it. Give me 10 minutes. He said, "We have less than that." She said, "Then give me what I asked for and I'll do it in 8. He said nothing. He went to the kitchen counter and poured water and drank it standing up and looked at Clara across the room. She was sitting at the table across from Garrett's equipment, with her coat off and her bag on the floor beside her, and she was reading the documents from Victoria's flash drive on a tablet Sue had provided. She had been reading for 30 minutes. She read the way she examined damaged work, systematically, from the outermost layer in, making notes on a legal pad she'd found in the kitchen drawer. He said, "What are you seeing?" She said, not looking up, "The fabricated documentation is very good. Whoever Graves is, he knows how to construct a timeline. The dates he used for the alleged extortion approach are the same dates as actual documented events. Restaurant reservations, gallery events, things that would have generated receipts. He built the lie inside the structure of real activity." He said, "That's a problem." She said, "It's not an insurmountable problem." She looked up. "The lie has the dates right, but the sequence wrong. He documented the extortion approach as preceding the relationship, but the relationship has a verifiable beginning, the acquisition event in October. If the acquisition event's guest list, security footage, and billing records still exist, they establish a sequence that contradicts his fabricated timeline." Alexander said, "The Art Institute event." She said, "I attended professionally. I signed in. There's a professional log. The Institute keeps security footage for 18 months. Iris looked up from her screen. She said, "That is the single most useful thing anyone has said in this room in the last hour." Alexander looked at Clara with an expression she recognized. Not gratitude exactly, but something adjacent. Something that acknowledged the specific nature of what she'd just contributed without making it into more than it was. He said, "Can you get the Institute to release it?" She said, "I'm on extended leave, but I'm not terminated. I have a professional relationship with the archivist that is entirely separate from anything involving you. Yes, I can get it. She picked up her phone. He said, Clara, not on that phone. She said, I know. She looked at him. I'm not the same woman I was in February. He held her gaze for a moment, then went to Sue and came back with one of the clean phones. She took it and made the call. It took 11 minutes and 2 transfers and a direct appeal to the archive director, a woman named Frances who had known Clara for 4 years and who said, after a pause, Clara, are you safe? And Clara said, I will be. And Frances said, I'll have it ready. While Clara was on the phone, Iris had finished reading the civil filing. She took off her reading glasses and set them on the table and said, the federal referral is the more serious problem, the civil matter we can fight. It's designed to contaminate public perception rather than produce a legal outcome. Thus, it's a pressure tool. But the federal referral is a different instrument. Voss has 14 months of material. Some of it is fabricated or manipulated, but not all of it. He found real things. Alexander said, which things? Iris looked at him steadily. She said, the Meridian warehouse transactions from 2022, the sub-entity structures on the North Michigan properties, and the fund movement through the Cayman account in March of last year. Alexander's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, the specific weight of a man absorbing a hit he knew was coming but had hoped would land differently. He said, those are real. Iris said yes. He said, how much exposure? Iris said significant. With a competent defense and the right judge, manageable. But Voss isn't planning to take this to a competent judge in a normal proceeding. He's planning to use the asset freeze and the public filings to generate enough pressure that the organization collapses from the inside before the case is ever fully adjudicated. He doesn't need to win in court. He needs to create enough chaos that your people stop trusting the structure. Garrett looked up from his station. He said, Alexander, the source. The room went quiet in the specific way of rooms where several people are all making the same assessment simultaneously. Garrett said, I've been running the access logs for the household system since we got here, cross-referencing the information Harrington's source passed with the window during which each of your people had access to it. There are 3 possibilities, and one of them has the strongest overlap. He turned the screen. Alexander looked at it. Clara, from across the table, saw his face. She had thought she understood the range of what Alexander Whitmore's face could do, having studied it for 4 months in the last several hours. She was wrong. What happened to his face when he read the name on Garrett's screen was something she had not seen before and hoped not to see again. A specific devastation, clean and total, like watching a load-bearing wall come down. He said very quietly, That's not possible. Garrett said, The overlap is 83% across 14 months of access logs. I checked it 3 times. Alexander said, Check it again. Garrett said, I will. But Alexander, 83% is not coincidence. Victoria, who had been standing at the kitchen doorway for the past 20 minutes, said, Who is it? Alexander didn't answer. He stepped away from the table. He went to the window and stood with his back to the room, both hands on the windowsill, looking at the courtyard below. Clara watched him. She watched the line of his shoulders and the tension in them and the way his breath was doing something it didn't usually do, shorter, less controlled, the specific respiratory signature of a person whose internal structure has just been compromised. She said, Alexander. Who is it? He didn't turn around. He said, Marcus. The name landed in the room. Clara felt it in the back of her throat before it reached her brain. Marcus, the security man in the lobby, who had waved her through every time she arrived for 4 months, who she had nodded to on the last morning when she walked out of the building forever. Marcus, who had known she was there. Marcus, who had logged every entry. Marcus, who had known her face and her schedule and the pattern of her presence in Alexander Whitmore's building. She said, He was there the morning I left. Alexander turned around. His face was reconstructed now. The composure back, the walls up. But it was effortful in a way it hadn't been before, and she could see the effort, and she thought he probably knew she could see it. He said, He has been with me for 11 years. She said, I know. He said, His son. I paid for his son's surgery 3 years ago, completely, without being asked. She said, I know, you told me once. He said, I told you once. He looked at the floor. 11 years. He was inside every security protocol I have. He knew the household layout, the communication systems, the schedules. He knew about you because he saw you every time you came and went. And then Harrington found him, or he found Harrington, and for 14 months, he stopped. He pressed one hand flat against the wall beside the window, not hard, just flat, as if he needed to feel something solid. He said, 14 months he was in my house every day. The room was very quiet. Iris said, this changes the operational picture significantly. If Marcus was Harrington's source, then the information Harrington has about the organization's internal structure is much deeper than I assumed. He doesn't just have financial records. He has, Alexander said, he has the physical layout of the organization, the people, the relationships, the way decisions get made and who makes them. Iris said, yes. Garrett said, there's something else. He turned back to his screen. The access logs show Marcus made 3 external contacts in the last 72 hours. I can't decrypt the content yet, but the timing. 2 of the 3 contacts were made after the Millhaven address was identified. Clara said, he told Harrington where I was. She said it without inflection, just the fact of it, clean and flat on the surface of the room. Garrett said, the 3rd contact was made this morning at 6:47. Alexander said, before I arrived in Millhaven. Garrett said, 40 minutes before. Alexander said, so Harrington knew I was going to find her before I got there. Garrett said, yes. Sue, from the corner where she'd been working quietly for the last hour, said, Alexander, I have the preliminary on the Voss-Harrington communication from the flash drive. I've been running comparison on the metadata. She looked up. These files were compiled by someone inside the Harrington organization, not Harrington himself and not Voss. The formatting, the file structure, the metadata. It's consistent with a professional archivist or administrator, someone who has been quietly collecting this material over a long period of time. Victoria straightened. Sue looked at her. She said, was it you? A beat. Victoria said, I started keeping records 14 months ago. When I understood what my father was doing, I started documenting everything I could access. Every meeting, every call I was peripherally aware of, every document that passed through spaces I had reason to be in. I gave you the compiled version, but I kept the originals. Alexander said, where? Victoria said, somewhere my father cannot access them. And somewhere you cannot access them either until I decide I trust you enough to say where. The room's temperature changed. Alexander looked at her. There was a long moment in which 2 things were simultaneously true. Alexander Whitmore needed what Victoria Harrington was holding, and Victoria Harrington knew it, and both of them understood exactly what that meant. He said, what do you want? Victoria said, I want out completely. A legal dissolution of the engagement that protects me financially. There are assets in my name that my father will try to claw back once this is over. I want those protected. I want documentation that I cooperated fully and voluntarily against an active conspiracy, which I can use if I ever need legal protection in the future. And I want... She paused. She said, I want to know that what happens to Miss Bennett's child will not be what almost happened. I want that settled before I hand over the originals. Alexander said, agreed. All of it. Victoria looked at Clara. Clara said, ask me what you want to ask me. Victoria said, are you going to forgive him? Clara said, that is not something I'm thinking about right now. Victoria said, you should think about it, not for his sake, for yours. Women who refuse to close wounds for too long tend to bleed out slowly. She paused. I have watched my mother do it for 30 years. Clara looked at her for a moment. She said, I'll file that. Victoria almost smiled. It was a thin, private expression that lasted about 1 second, but it was real, and Clara saw it. Then Garrett said, we have a problem. Everyone looked at him. He said, I'm monitoring the building's external network perimeter. Standard sweep. He looked at Alexander. There is a vehicle that has been parked on the cross street for the last 40 minutes. Dark blue. Partial plate matches a registered vehicle associated with the Harrington Group's security division. Silence. He said, "Either they followed one of you here or they already knew about this property." Alexander said, "Marcus." Garrett said, "He had access to the address through the holding company records." "It's possible." Clara stood up. The movement was deliberate and unhurried, and she was aware of the child's weight as she did it. That constant physical reminder of everything that was at stake in this room, everything that could not be abstract. She said, "Can they see into the building?" Garrett said, "The windows face the wrong direction for the vehicle's position. If they stay where they are, no." She said, "How long before they move?" Garrett said, "Unknown." She said, "What do we have in this building that we cannot afford to lose?" She looked at Sue, who looked at Alexander. He said, "The flash drive contents, Victoria's originals, wherever they are, Iris's analysis, and you." She said, "The first three can be transmitted, backed up, duplicated, and held in multiple locations." He said, "Yes." She said, "Then the only thing in this building that cannot be copied is the people." He said, "Clara." She said, "I'm not suggesting we run. I'm suggesting we understand what we actually have to protect before we decide how to protect it." She looked around the room. What Alexander had been treating as a security problem was actually a documentation problem. Richard Harrington has spent 14 months building a case. The case is built on real financial activity plus fabricated context. The fabricated context is what makes the real activity look criminal. Iris said, "Go on." Clara said, "If we strip the fabricated context from the record and replace it with the documented reality, the real activity becomes ambiguous rather than criminal. And in federal proceedings, ambiguous is not the same as guilty. It's not a clean outcome, but it changes the nature of the fight." She looked at Iris. "What's the fastest legal mechanism to challenge the preliminary freeze order?" Iris said, with the expression of a person who has just had to update their assessment of someone. "Emergency motion in district court. We need to demonstrate that the freeze was obtained through materially false representations. If we can show Voss used fabricated documentation as part of his referral," Clara said, "we can show that. The fabricated documentation has a sequencing flaw I identified this afternoon. It's specific, it's demonstrable, and it's on the face of the documents. It doesn't require additional discovery." Iris said, "That would get us in front of a judge within 48 hours. Clara said, "Then that's where we start." She sat back down and pulled the legal pad toward her. Her handwriting was precise and small, the handwriting of someone accustomed to notating conditions on damaged surfaces with limited space. She said, "Tell me exactly what Voss's filing said about the timeline, word for word." Iris told her. Clara wrote, "For the next 90 minutes, the room worked. Garrett maintained the perimeter watch and reported that the dark blue vehicle had moved twice but remained within the same block radius, watching, not moving, not yet deciding. Sue encrypted and transmitted the flash drive contents to 3 separate secure locations Victoria provided and 2 that Alexander specified. Iris drafted the emergency motion framework while Clara annotated the timeline discrepancy with the specificity it required, cross-referencing dates, citing the verifiable record points, building the argument the way she built an analysis of a damaged work, from evidence outward, not from conclusion backward. Alexander moved through the room and made phone calls and said little, and when he came near Clara, he moved carefully around her the way a person moves around something they are afraid to disturb, not from weakness, but from the specific caution of a man who has finally understood the cost of being careless. At 7:40 in the evening, Garrett said, "The vehicle is gone." The relief in the room was brief and unsentimental. Alexander said, "They'll report back. We have limited time before the next move." Clara looked up from the legal pad. She had been writing for so long that her hand ached in the specific way of wrists not accustomed to sustained notation, and she rotated it once without looking at it and kept looking at Alexander. She said, "How limited?" He said, "Hours, maybe less." She said, "Then the motion needs to be filed tonight." Iris said, "I need 2 more hours to finish it properly." Alexander said, "You have 90 minutes." Iris said, "Then I need coffee," and silence. Sue put on coffee. The room went quiet in the productive way of people working against a deadline they believe they can meet. Clara stood and stretched, carefully, the way everything was done carefully now, the body insisting on its own physics. And she went to the window Alexander had stood at earlier and looked out at the courtyard. The April evening had gone dark, and the courtyard lights were on, casting the bare branch trees in flat yellow. She heard him come up beside her. She didn't turn. He said, "I never told Marcus about the pregnancy." "He saw it." "He must have. The timeline suggests he was still observing you when you left in February, but I never said it aloud to anyone in the household." She said, "That doesn't change what he passed on." He said, "No, it doesn't." She said, 11 years. He said, 11 years. She said, "Do you think you'll ever understand why?" He said, "I think I'll spend a long time trying not to need to." She looked out at the courtyard. She said, "When this is over." He said, "Yes." She said, "I didn't finish." He said, "I know, but whatever comes after it, yes." She turned and looked at him then, really looked, the way she hadn't let herself do in the bakery, or in the car, or in the room full of people and problems. She looked at him the way she looked at damaged work. Not at the surface damage, not at the crude restoration attempts by the people who came before, but at the original structure underneath. What was there? What had always been there, under everything? He looked back at her without flinching, then Garrett's voice from the kitchen, sharp and sudden. "Alexander." The perimeter alarm on the building's east entrance just triggered. Everyone moved. Alexander was across the room in 4 steps. Garrett's screen showed the east entrance camera, the service door off the courtyard, which should have been sealed. It was open. Standing in the doorway, framed by the courtyard light, was Marcus. He was alone. His hands were visible. He was not holding anything. He looked, in the camera's flat resolution, exactly as he always had. The familiar face, the posture she'd seen in a lobby 100 times. The man she had nodded to on the last morning she walked out of that building. He was looking directly into the camera. He said something. The external microphone was not sophisticated enough to carry audio clearly, but Clara, who had spent years reading surfaces, read his lips. 2 words. She said, "He's saying he's sorry." Alexander's jaw was tight. He said, "Open the door." Garrett said, "Alexander, this could be..." He said, "Open the door." Garrett opened the door remotely. Marcus walked in. He stopped in the middle of the room and looked at Alexander, and he said nothing for a moment, just stood there with his hands at his sides and his face doing the thing that faces do when a person has carried something for a long time and has finally arrived at the place where they put it down. He said, "Harrington has a second source, someone you haven't identified. I came to tell you who it is." He looked at the room. He looked at Iris, at Garrett, at Sue. He looked at Victoria. He looked at Clara. He said, "You need to sit down for this." And then he said the name. And the room went so quiet that Clara could hear the courtyard wind moving through the bare branch trees outside the window. And she understood, in the cold clarity of that silence, that everything they had built in the last 90 minutes, the motion, the timeline, the plan, had just become insufficient. The name Marcus said was Iris Chen. Nobody moved for 3 full seconds. Then Alexander turned and looked at Iris, and Iris looked back at him with her reading glasses still pushed up on her head and her hands flat on the table on either side of her laptop, and her face doing something Clara had not seen it do in the 4 hours she'd known her. Absolutely nothing. Blank in the specific way of a person who has stopped performing and is simply waiting for what comes next. Alexander said, "Iris?" She said, "Let him finish." Marcus said, "She's been Harrington's legal contact inside your structure for 8 months. Not the organizational details. That was me, and I'll answer for that. What she gave him was different. She gave him the legal architecture, the entity structures, the exact language of the sub-agreements, the things that made Voss's case technically prosecutable rather than just circumstantially suggestive. He said it without accusation, just with the flatness of a man delivering a report he wishes he didn't have. Iris said, "That's a serious allegation." Marcus said, "I was in the room twice. I didn't know what I was seeing the first time. The second time I understood." Alexander said, "When?" Marcus said, 6 weeks ago and 3 weeks ago. Your building, the conference room on 32. She met with a man I identified later as one of Harrington's legal associates. Not Graves, different person, younger. The meetings lasted approximately 40 minutes each. The room was very still. Garrett had his hand near the keyboard but wasn't typing. Sue had set down what she was holding. Victoria was against the far wall with her arms crossed, and her expression closed in the way of someone who is not surprised but is not pleased either. Clara was looking at Iris. Iris had not moved her hands from the table. She was looking at Marcus with the specific expression of someone calculating. Not whether to lie, Clara thought, but how much the truth would cost. Alexander said, "Iris." She looked at him. She said, "He's not wrong." The confession was so clean it was almost worse than a denial would have been. She said, "Harrington approached me 10 months ago. He had documentation on a client matter from 2019 that would have cost me my license and potentially my freedom. He offered me a choice. I made the wrong one. I've been making it for 10 months. Alexander said, "You drafted the emergency motion tonight." She said, "Yes." He said, "Is it compromised?" A pause. She said, "No. I drafted it clean. Whatever else I've done, I drafted it clean tonight because I could see—" She stopped. She pressed her hands flat on the table. "Because I could see what he's doing to her." She looked at Clara without quite meeting her eyes. What he's planning to do to her child. And I decided 10 months of wrong choices was enough. Alexander said, "You decided." She said, "Yes." He said, "Without telling me." She said, "I'm telling you now." His voice was very quiet when he said, "You were the third call, the one Marcus made this morning at 6:47. Marcus said, "I called her before I called anyone else, because I needed to know if she'd already moved against us with what she knew. She hadn't. She said she was going to fix it." Alexander said, "This is your version of fixing it." Iris said, "It's the version I have." The silence stretched. Then Clara said, "What does she know that's not on the flash drive?" Everyone looked at her. She said, "Victoria's documentation covers Harrington and Voss. Marcus covered the household access. What does Iris know that neither of them knows?" Iris said, "The legal entities, the structures your father built before Alexander took over, the ones that predate any of Harrington's documentation." She paused. "And the one account Voss doesn't have, a 2003 trust structure under a name that was never connected to the Whitmore organization in any filing I've ever seen. Harrington asked me specifically about it 8 months ago. I told him I didn't know what he was referring to." Alexander went very still. He said, "You told him that?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because some things you don't give away, even when you're giving things away." Something moved across Alexander's face that was not forgiveness and was not absolution and was not warmth. It was something more complicated than all of those, the specific expression of a man recalibrating. He said, "Garrett, can you use what Marcus has to verify his version of the meetings?" Garrett said, "Building security logs would show access on those dates and times." Alexander said, "Do it." Garrett did it. It took 4 minutes. He said, "Confirmed." 2 entries matching the dates Marcus gave. The second individual's access was logged under a maintenance cover. Alexander looked at Iris for a long moment. He said, "You stay in this room. You finish the motion. You don't touch a phone that isn't Sue's. And when this is over, you and I will have a conversation about 2019 and I will decide what I decide." Iris said, "Understood." He looked at Marcus. He said, "Same terms." Marcus said, "I didn't come here for terms. I came because I owe you this, and it doesn't cover what I owe you." He paused. His son. He looked at the floor. "Harrington found my son's medical situation in your personal records. He told me the surgery debt would be recalled, that your financial support would be flagged as an illegal payment in the investigation. He said my son would be—" He stopped. He cleared his throat. "I know that doesn't make it right." Alexander said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Sit down, Marcus." Marcus sat. They worked through the night. Iris finished the emergency motion at 11:47 with Clara's timeline analysis embedded as the central evidentiary exhibit and Sue's encrypted transmission records as supporting documentation. Garrett filed it electronically at 11:59 through a federal court access portal that Iris had credentials for, which was either ironic or appropriate depending on how you looked at it. At 2 in the morning, Alexander received a call from a judge's clerk. Emergency hearing. 7 a.m. Northern District Federal Courthouse. Judge Patricia Aldean presiding. He came out of the back room and told the room. Clara looked up from the legal pad. She had been annotating for 6 hours straight, and her wrist ached deeply, and she had eaten nothing since the morning rolls she'd pulled from the oven in Millhaven before everything changed. She said, "Aldean." Iris from the table said, "She's clean. No Harrington connections that I know of, and I know most of them." Clara said, "Then we have a chance." Alexander said, "We have a chance." He looked at her. He said, "You need to sleep." She said, "So do you." He said, "I'll sleep after." She said, "That's what I said." He said, "Clara, you're 8 months pregnant and you've been working for 18 hours and the hearing is at 7 and I need you." He stopped. Recalibrated. "I need you functional tomorrow." She looked at him. She said, "I know what you need. Show me where I can sleep for 3 hours and then wake me at 5. He showed her the bedroom at the end of the hall. It was plain and clean, and the window faced the courtyard with its bare branch trees. She lay down on top of the covers with her coat over her for extra warmth and was asleep in approximately 4 minutes, which was a thing she'd learned to do during her conservation training. Sleep when you can, fast and without ceremony, because the work requires everything you have. She woke at 4:47 to the sound of raised voices in the kitchen. She was on her feet and moving before she was fully conscious, the body's alarm systems overriding the brain's preference for sequencing. She came into the kitchen doorway and found Alexander and Victoria standing at opposite ends of the kitchen table with Garrett between them in the specific posture of a person who has decided that being between two people is preferable to what might happen if they weren't. Alexander said, "He moved up the timeline again." Victoria said, "That is not my fault." He said, "You had the originals. You held them for leverage." She said, "I held them for protection." "There is a difference, and you know there is a difference." He said, "If you'd given them to us last night, we'd have had them in the filing." She said, "If you'd been someone I trusted last night, I'd have given them to you last night. That is a problem of your creation, not mine." Clara said, "What happened?" Both of them stopped. Garrett said, "Harrington's legal team filed a counter motion at 3 a.m., attempting to preempt the federal hearing. They're claiming the flash drive was obtained illegally and that the emergency motion itself constitutes an obstruction of an active federal investigation." Clara said, "Can they make that stick?" Iris from the table said, "Not if we have the originals. The flash drive alone has a chain of custody question because of how it was transferred. But if Victoria's original documents exist in a form that predates tonight's filing," Victoria said, "they do. They've been in a safety deposit box at a bank in Evanston for 4 months, under a name that is not mine and not connected to any Harrington entity." Alexander said, "We need them before 7. Victoria said, "I know that." He said, "Then." She said, I said I know that, Alexander. I'm not withholding them. I'm telling you the practical reality of accessing a safety deposit box in Evanston at 5 in the morning, which is that it requires the bank manager, and the bank manager requires a phone call that I'm about to make if you will stop talking." He closed his mouth. She made the call. The bank manager, to his credit, and possibly because he recognized Victoria's last name from the kind of local financial history that certain bank managers carry in their heads, agreed to meet her at the Evanston branch at 6:15. They split into 2 cars again. Victoria and Sue to Evanston, Alexander and Clara and Garrett and Iris to the federal courthouse, where Iris needed to be present and credentialed before 7. Marcus stayed at the Garfield Park building. He sat at the kitchen table with his hands folded and didn't ask for anything, which was its own kind of answer to a question nobody had asked aloud. The courthouse was federal gray and federal cold in the early April morning, the plaza empty except for security personnel and the specific category of person who is at a federal courthouse before 7 a.m., which is to say people who have run out of better options. Clara walked through the security checkpoint with her bag and her 8 months' wait, and the guard looked at her twice and said nothing. Alexander was stopped. A federal agent, not courthouse security, federal, with the particular quality of stillness that distinguished the two, was waiting past the security checkpoint with a second agent beside him. The first agent said, "Mr. Whitmore, I'm Agent Carver, FBI Field Office, Chicago. I need to ask you to come with me." Alexander said, "I have a hearing in 40 minutes. Carver said, "I'm aware of the hearing. This won't take 40 minutes. Claire said, "I'm coming." Carver looked at her. She said, "I'm Clara Bennett. I'm listed as a supporting declarant in the motion before Judge Aldine. If you're separating us before the hearing, that is something Judge Aldine will want to know about." Carver looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating. He said, "You can wait outside the room." She said, "I'll wait inside it." He said, "Ma'am?" She said, I'm 8 months pregnant and I have been on my feet for 20 hours, and I would strongly recommend against making the next sentence an argument." He did not make the next sentence an argument. The room was a standard federal interview room. Table, 4 chairs, overhead fluorescent, the faint smell of institutional coffee. Carver sat across from Alexander. The second agent stood by the door. Clara sat beside Alexander with her hands folded on the table and her spine straight, and the legal pad she'd carried from Garfield Park in front of her because she had not gotten this far by going anywhere without documentation. Carver said, "Mr. Whitmore, I want to be direct with you. I've been following Daniel Voss's referral for 6 weeks and I have concerns about the sourcing." Alexander said, "What kind of concerns?" Carver said, "The kind that require me to be in this room before 7 a.m. He looked at his hands. Voss submitted this referral through an expedited channel that bypassed my unit's standard review. When I flagged it, I was told it was under a separate authority. When I requested the underlying documentation, I received redacted versions that were inconsistent with the summary filing." Clara said, "In what way inconsistent?" Carver looked at her. She said, "I analyzed the civil documentation last night. I found a sequencing error in the fabricated timeline. If the federal referral has the same sourcing problem, the inconsistency would appear in—" She named the specific document reference and the page number and the date. Carver was quiet for a moment. He said, "You've seen the filing," she said. "I've read everything I could access. I'm a conservator. I read damaged surfaces for a living. The damage in Voss's filing is on page 7, the 3rd paragraph, where the alleged first contact is dated 14 days before the event that supposedly precipitated it." Carver said, "How do you know that date is wrong?" She said, "Because I was there. I have documentation, I have a professional log, I have security footage pending transfer from the Art Institute of Chicago that establishes where I was on that date and who I was with, and it contradicts the filing's timeline entirely." Carver looked at Alexander. He said, "You understand what you're asking me to do?" Alexander said, "I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm telling you what I know. What you do with it is your determination." Carver said, "Voss has significant institutional support." Alexander said, "Richard Harrington has been building that support for 14 months. The documentation on how he built it is currently in a safety deposit box in Evanston and will be in this building before the hearing." Carver said, "If it isn't?" Alexander said, "It will be." Carver looked at his watch. He looked at Clara. He looked at Alexander. He stood up. He said, "The hearing is in 32 minutes. I'll be in the courtroom." He left. Alexander looked at Clara. She said, "Call Sue." He called. Sue answered on the first ring and said they had the documents and were 12 minutes from the courthouse. He said, "You need to be in 9. She said they would be in 8. They were in 7. Victoria walked into the courtroom at 6:53 with a document case that she handed to Iris without ceremony, and Iris spent the next 6 minutes tabbing and flagging with the concentrated speed of a professional who has spent 30 years doing exactly this under exactly this kind of pressure. She handed the complete package to the court clerk at 6:59. Judge Patricia Aldine came in at 7 exactly. She was a small woman in her early 60s with the particular quality of presence that certain judges develop. Not large, not loud, just the specific gravity of someone for whom the room had been arranging itself for decades. She looked at the courtroom over her reading glasses. She looked at the opposing counsel, a team of 3 from Harrington's legal representation, who were already radiating the kind of expensive confidence that comes from never having lost before anything goes wrong. She looked at Iris, who was standing at the plaintiff's table with Alexander and Clara and Garrett. She said, Ms. Chen, I've read your motion. Iris said, "Thank you, Your Honor." Aldine said, "I've also received a counter motion from counsel for Richard Harrington claiming evidentiary impropriety in your filing." Harrington's lead counsel said, "Your Honor, the documents presented by the plaintiff were obtained through a breach of—" Aldine said, "I didn't ask you yet." He stopped. She said, "Ms. Chen, walk me through the sequencing error on page 7 of the original federal referral." And Iris did. She walked through it with the precision that the motion described, and when she was done, she referenced the supplementary documentation. Victoria's originals, time-stamped and predating the federal filing by 4 months, and she referenced Agent Carver, who was sitting in the gallery in civilian clothes and raised his hand when Aldine looked that direction with the expression of someone who had expected him to be there. Harrington's counsel objected 3 times. Aldine overruled twice and sustained once on a technicality that Iris immediately remedied with a supplemental filing she had apparently anticipated and pre-prepared, which caused Harrington's lead counsel to lose, for just a moment, the expensive confidence. At 8:17, Judge Aldine said, "I'm lifting the preliminary freeze order pending full evidentiary review. I'm also referring the sourcing irregularities in the federal referral to the Chief Judge's office for independent review. Counsel for Mr. Harrington, you are advised that I am examining your client's role in the preparation of the original documentation with significant interest." The lead counsel said, "Your Honor, my client." Aldine said, "We'll be hearing from this court shortly." She looked at her papers. She looked up. She said, "We're adjourned." She left. The room let out a collective breath. Alexander stood very still for a moment. Iris said quietly, "It's not over. The evidentiary review could take weeks. Harrington will appeal." He said, "I know." She said, "But the freeze is lifted. The organization can function." He said, "I know." He turned and looked at Clara. She was still sitting because her lower back had been delivering a specific and insistent message for the past 40 minutes that she had been ignoring by force of will, and standing up required a moment of preparation that she was still gathering. She looked back at him. She said, "Don't say it." He said, "Say what?" She said, "Whatever you're about to say with that face, save it." He said, "I wasn't going to say anything." She said, "You were going to say something about being right about the sequencing error." He said, "I was going to say thank you." She said, "Oh." She stood up. She was standing with one hand on the table when she felt it. Not the back pain she'd been managing, something different, lower. A pressure that had a specific quality she'd been told about and had filed in the category of things she'd recognize when they happened. She recognized it. She said, "Alexander." He said, "Yes." She said, "I need you to not react the way I think you're going to react." He said, "What's happening?" She said, "I think we need to go to the hospital." He looked at her. His face did the thing again. The fracture she'd seen in the bakery doorway. The same specific crack in the composure. But this time it was not grief. It was something that looked, on the face of Alexander Whitmore, almost like terror. She said, "It's fine. It's early, but it's not too early. The doctor said 38 weeks was—" He was already moving. She said, "Alexander, stop, listen to me. I need you to carry my bag and take my arm and walk out of this building at a normal pace, because I'm not going to be rushed through a federal courthouse like something is wrong when everything is actually—" She stopped. She breathed. She said, "Okay, maybe walk a little faster." He took her bag. He took her arm. He walked her out of the federal courthouse into the April morning where the city had been going about its business for hours, entirely unaware that inside that building something had just shifted, not solved, not completed, but shifted. And the first contraction came fully as they reached the bottom of the steps, and Clara stood on the federal courthouse steps and breathed through it with her hand on Alexander Whitmore's arm and the city moving all around them in the ordinary way of a Thursday morning. She said, when it passed, "Get the car." He said, "Already done." She said, "How?" He said, "Garrett." She said, "You called him before I finished the sentence." He said, "Yes." She said, "You were prepared for this." He said, with something in his voice that was not quite steady, "I've been prepared for this for 6 weeks." She looked at him. She said, "We're not finished with Harrington." He said, "No." She said, He's going to move again, today probably. When he hears about the hearing, he said, yes. She said, you have what you need to respond. He said, I have most of what I need. The car pulled up, Garrett at the wheel. She said, Alexander. He said, Clara. She said, whatever happens today, with Harrington, with all of it, you don't leave the hospital. He looked at her. She said, I mean it. You stay. He said, I know where I'm supposed to be. She said, that's not the same thing as staying. He said, Clara, I'm not leaving. She held his gaze for one more second. Then the second contraction arrived, and she got in the car, and he got in beside her, and Garrett drove north toward Northwestern Memorial, and Alexander's phone began ringing. It was Sue, and then Iris, and then a number he didn't recognize, and he silenced all of them. He put the phone face down on his knee. He put his other hand over Clara's, and she let him, which cost her something and was worth it. They were 4 blocks from the hospital when his phone vibrated once, screen up, and the message preview was visible to both of them. It was from a number labeled only RH. It read, enjoy the hospital. The reception tonight will proceed as planned. When you're not there to stop it, everything reverts. Clara read it. She said, what reception? He said, the wedding ceremony. It was scheduled for tonight at the Meridian Ballroom. I assumed it was canceled when... She said, he didn't cancel it. He said no. She said, he kept it scheduled because he knew this might happen. Because the ceremony itself is the trigger point. If it proceeds, he said, the alliance goes on paper. The contractual terms activate. The legal structures he built around the merger. She said, it doesn't matter that the engagement is dissolved. If the ceremony proceeds as a Harrington-Whitmore event with witnesses and documentation, he said, he's planned for every outcome, including this one. The car stopped at the hospital entrance. She looked at him. The third contraction was building. She could feel the shape of it coming, the body doing what it had decided to do regardless of timing or circumstance or the particular chaos of the day. She said, go. He said, Clara. She said, I mean go to the ballroom, stop him. I'm going to be fine. This is going to take hours, Alexander. It doesn't happen like it does in the movies. He said, I'm not leaving you. She said, if you don't go, everything we did today means nothing. The hearing, the documents, the motion. He walks it all back through that ceremony. He said, Clara, I am not leaving you in a hospital to go to a ballroom. She said, then send someone. He said, there's no one who can do what needs to be done there. She said, there's Victoria. He went very still. She said, she was engaged to the man. She is standing at that ceremony that none of your people have. She has the documents. She has the originals. She has the knowledge of everything her father built. And she has made a decision about what she's done with her life. And she stopped, breathed through the peak of the contraction, breathed out. She is absolutely furious, and that is exactly what that room needs tonight. She said, call her. He didn't move. She said, Alexander, call her and then come upstairs with me. He picked up the phone. He called Victoria. She answered on the second ring, and he told her in 40 seconds what needed to happen, and there was a pause on Victoria's end that lasted long enough to mean something, and then she said very clearly, I'll be there. He ended the call. He got out of the car and came around and opened her door and offered his hand, and she took it, and she stood up in the April morning outside Northwestern Memorial Hospital, and she looked at him and she said, now we go upstairs. And they went upstairs. The labor room was small and very white and smelled of antiseptic and the particular neutral quality of institutional air, and Clara had been in it for 2 hours before she stopped trying to track what was happening in the ballroom downtown and started paying attention only to what was happening in her own body. That was a discipline. It required the same deliberate narrowing of focus she brought to damaged work. Set aside everything peripheral, attend only to what is directly in front of you, trust that the peripheral will resolve or it won't, and either way you cannot address it from here. Alexander sat in the chair beside the bed and did not look at his phone. She noticed that. She was in the middle of a contraction when she noticed it. The phone face down on the chair arm, his hands folded, his eyes on her, and the noticing was brief and specific, and she filed it without comment, because commenting would have required breath she was using for other purposes. The nurse, a woman named Patricia, who had the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who had seen every version of this and found most of them manageable, checked the monitor and made a notation and said, "You're progressing well." She said it the way nurses say things that are true but incomplete, and Clara understood that well was a relative term and that progressing well still meant hours. She said, between contractions, "Tell me what you know about the ballroom." He said, "Victoria is there. Sue is with her." She said, "Garrett." He said, "Positioned outside with 2 others." She said, "Harrington will have security." He said, "Yes." She said, "Victoria can't go in there alone." He said, "She's not alone. And she's not going in as someone who needs protection. She's going in as the bride." Clara looked at him. He said, "The ceremony is still listed under her name. She has every right to be in that room. More right than anyone else there. Harrington can't remove her without creating exactly the scene he's been trying to avoid." Clara said, "He'll try to neutralize her before she can speak." He said, "She knows that. She went in 40 minutes early. She's already in the building." Another contraction arrived, and Clara stopped speaking and breathed through it with her eyes on the ceiling, counting the texture of the acoustic tiles the way she sometimes counted brushstrokes in a damaged canvas. Not because it helped, but because counting something was better than counting nothing. When it passed, she said, "An iris." He said, "She filed the supplementary documentation with the court clerk at 9 a.m. The record is established. Whatever happens tonight, the legal foundation is in place." She said, "Carver." He said, "He's been briefed on the ballroom situation. He can't act on it officially. It's not his jurisdiction, but he knows. If something happens that creates federal jurisdiction, he'll be positioned to respond." She said, "You planned for this?" He said, "I planned for him to move tonight. I didn't know it would look exactly like this." She said, "You should have told me." He said, "You were in labor." She said, "I was in labor before I knew about the ballroom." "When did you plan this?" He said, "In the car, on the way here." She looked at him. He said, "Clara, I was in a car with you while you were having contractions. I did not plan this extensively. I made 4 phone calls and then I put the phone down." She said, 4 phone calls. He said, "Victoria, Sue, Garrett, Iris." She said, "That's sufficient, actually." He said, "I know." The contraction that came 20 minutes later was different from the ones before it, harder and longer and with a quality of inevitability that Patricia recognized immediately and acted on with quiet efficiency. And for the next period of time, Clara was not thinking about ballrooms or federal hearings or the particular chess game that had been running since February. She was thinking about nothing except the most fundamental thing, the oldest work, the thing that required everything she had, and then required more. Alexander did not look at his phone. That was the fact she held on to during the hardest parts, not as comfort exactly, not as forgiveness, but as data, as evidence. The man who controlled everything by never letting anything out of his sight had put his phone face down and was looking at her, only at her, and she found she could not dismiss the weight of that as easily as she would have preferred. At 11:41 in the evening, their daughter was born. She was small and red-faced and furious about the transition from one world to another, which Clara found entirely reasonable. She had her father's dark hair, a full surprising amount of it, and when Patricia placed her on Clara's chest, the fury subsided into something quieter, a kind of exhausted bewilderment that Clara recognized because she felt it too. She looked at her daughter. She had prepared herself for this moment in the abstract way you prepare for things you cannot fully imagine, had thought about it in the bakery in Millhaven at 3 a.m, had imagined it in the conservation lab before she knew any of this would happen. The preparation was insufficient. It always was, probably. The actual weight of an actual person who had not existed until now was not something you could prepare for. She looked up. Alexander was standing beside the bed, and his face was doing the thing she had seen twice before. The fracture, the specific crack in the composure. But this time there was nothing underneath it that looked like grief or terror or calculation. What was underneath it was something she didn't have a word for. Something that looked like a man who has spent his entire adult life moving through the world at a controlled distance from everything discovering, in a hospital room in Chicago on a Thursday night in April, that he has run out of distance. He looked at his daughter. His daughter looked at nothing in particular, in the way of newborns who are still deciding whether the world is worth attending to. Clara said, "You can hold her." He looked at her like she'd said something that required translation. She said, "Alexander, she's yours. You can hold her." He sat on the edge of the bed. Patricia showed him the position with the brisk competence of a woman who had done this 1,000 times, and he adjusted his arms exactly as directed, which was the most obedient she had ever seen him. And then his daughter was in his arms. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. Clara watched him hold his daughter and felt something shift in her chest that had been locked since February. Not unlock exactly, not dissolve, but shift, move, acknowledge its own presence in a way it hadn't been willing to before. She said, "I haven't decided on a name." He said, still looking at his daughter, "I know." She said, "I've been waiting." He said, "For what?" She said, "To see what she looked like." He finally looked up. She said, "She looks like someone who already knows what she thinks." He said, "Yes." She said, "Eleanor, my grandmother's name." He looked at Eleanor. He said, "Eleanor Whitmore Bennett." The order of the names was a negotiation compressed into 4 words, and both of them understood that, and neither of them addressed it directly, and the result was what she had said first. He said, "Eleanor Whitmore Bennett." She said, "Yes." At 12:37 in the morning, his phone vibrated. He looked at her before he looked at it. She said, "Look." He looked. He read what was there. His expression went through several things quickly and settled on something she couldn't entirely read. He said, "It's Sue." He turned the screen toward her. The message read, "It's done. Victoria has the room. You should see this." Below the text was a video, 40 seconds of footage from inside the Meridian Ballroom, shot on a phone from the gallery level. The ballroom was full, hundreds of people. The particular gathering of money and power and influence that such events produce, everyone in formal dress, the room lit with the specific golden excess of a ceremony designed to announce its own importance. The ceremony structure was in place, the floral arrangements, the assembled guests, the whole elaborate machinery of an event that had been planned for months and that Richard Harrington had spent 14 months using as a weapon. At the front of the room, at the altar point, Victoria Harrington was standing, not beside Alexander. There was no Alexander. Victoria was standing alone at the center of the room, and she had a microphone, and the guests were very quiet in the way that large rooms go quiet when something has gone wrong with the program and no one is sure yet whether to leave. There was no audio on the video, but Clara could see Victoria speaking, could see the large screens on either side of the ceremonial space, screens that had been set up to display wedding imagery, now displaying something else. Documents, financial records, communication logs. The compressed visual language of 14 months of evidence, displayed in a ballroom in Chicago in front of everyone Richard Harrington had ever needed to believe in him. Clara watched Richard Harrington on the screen. He was in the front row, as befitted the father of the bride, and she watched his face move through denial and then through something harder to name. The specific expression of a person watching the architecture of their life's work being demonstrated in public to be exactly what it was. He stood up at some point in the 40 seconds. He moved toward the front of the room, and then 2 men she didn't recognize, not Garrett's people, not anyone she'd seen before, stepped into the frame and positioned themselves between Harrington and the microphone. The video ended. Alexander said, "Those are Carver's people." Clara said, "He found his federal jurisdiction." Alexander said, "Apparently." She said, "Victoria." He said, "Yes." There was a silence. Clara said, "She did that alone." He said, "She did that alone." Clara looked at Eleanor, who had fallen asleep in the particular absolute way of newborns, completely, without reservation, as if sleep were the only logical response to having just arrived in the world. She said, "Is it over?" He said, "The criminal component will take months to resolve in court. Harrington will be charged. Carver has what he needs now, with the public disclosure and the witnesses. Voss will be investigated by the Chief Judge's office, and that investigation will find what it needs to find, because Iris's supplementary documentation is thorough. The civil filing against you will be withdrawn or dismissed once the fabricated documentation is exposed as part of the broader fraud. She said, Marcus. He said, I'll deal with Marcus. She said, what does that mean? He said, it means I'll deal with it in a way that accounts for why he did what he did and what he chose to do at the end. He paused. His son has nothing to do with what his father did. That doesn't change. She looked at him. She said, you're going to pay for the son's ongoing care. He said, yes. She said, even after what Marcus did. He said, the son didn't do anything. She held his gaze for a moment. She said, and Iris. He said, that's more complicated. What she gave them, the entity structures, the sub-agreements, she'll have to answer for that professionally. Legally, I can protect her if she cooperates fully with Carver, which she will. Whether she keeps her license is a bar association matter. Clara said, she drafted the motion clean. He said, I know. She said, that matters. He said, I know that too. The room was quiet. Patricia came in and checked Eleanor and checked Clara and made her notations and left with the efficiency of someone who understood that there are moments in hospital rooms that belong only to the people in them. Clara said, I want to go back to the institute. Alexander said, I know, she said, not yet. But when I'm ready, I want to go back to my work. He said, yes, she said, and I want my own space, not the penthouse. He said, we'll find something. She said, I'll find something, you can help look. He said, the distinction being, she said, the distinction being that I choose it, not you. He said, understood. She said, and Eleanor and I will not be hidden, not from anyone in your life, not from anything your life involves. He said, no, never. She said, I need you to understand that this is not forgiveness. What happened in February, the 4 months of being kept separate from your life, I haven't processed all of that yet, and I'm not going to tell you I have. He said, I understand that. She said, what I'm telling you is that I'm choosing to continue, not because I've decided everything is fine, because I've decided you're worth the work, and because... She looked at Eleanor. She said, because she deserves to have both of her parents making the effort. He said, I will make the effort. Every day. She said, I know you'll intend to. He said, Clara. She said, intending is not the same as doing. You know that. You run an organization on that distinction. He said, then I will do it every day. And when I fail, because I will fail, I'm not making promises I can't keep. I will acknowledge it and correct it. She looked at him. She said, that's actually the most honest thing you've ever said to me. He said, I've been working up to it. Something moved across her face that was not quite a smile, but was in the same territory. She said, go to sleep, Alexander. The chair reclines. He said, I'm fine. She said, the chair reclines, and you've been awake for 22 hours, and Eleanor is going to be awake in approximately 2 of them, wanting things. And when that happens, I need you functional. He said, you need me. She said, I need you functional. Don't overinterpret. He reclined the chair. In the particular silence of a hospital at 2 a.m, with the monitoring equipment making its low regular sound and Eleanor breathing the new small breath of someone who has just started, Clara lay in the bed and looked at the ceiling and allowed herself, for the first time since a February morning when a television was on for background noise, to feel the full weight of everything that had happened. It was very heavy. She felt it the way she felt a difficult piece of work at the end of a long day, the exhaustion of it, the specific satisfaction beneath the exhaustion, the knowledge that damage had been addressed rather than ignored, that surfaces had been examined and found to be not what they appeared and treated accordingly, that the work was not finished but the most critical assessment was done. She thought about Victoria standing in the Meridian ballroom with a microphone, alone at the altar of a ceremony she hadn't chosen, dismantling the machinery her father had built. She thought about what that had cost and how it was not her story to tell, but she would not forget it. She thought about Marcus sitting at a kitchen table in Garfield Park with his hands folded, having made one wrong choice, and then, at the edge of everything, one right one. She thought about Iris drafting a motion clean at midnight when she had every reason to draft it otherwise. She thought about what people do when they are past the point where self-interest provides clear instruction and what that revealed about them. She thought about the ultrasound photograph burning in Alexander's kitchen sink in February. She thought about the specific decision she'd made in that moment, to take nothing, to leave everything, to disappear completely. And she recognized it for what it had been, not only grief and not only fury, but a woman who had finally understood the value of what she was and had refused to accept less than it was worth. She had not been wrong to leave. She had not been wrong to stay gone for 14 weeks. She had not been wrong to come back on her own terms. She would not be wrong to continue, carefully, with her eyes open, accounting for damage, and working with it rather than pretending it wasn't there. That was what she knew how to do. Eleanor made a small sound in the bassinet beside the bed. Not quite a cry, something more exploratory than that. The sound of someone testing whether sound was a useful tool. Clara turned her head and looked at her daughter in the low hospital light. She said quietly, "I know. It's a lot." Eleanor considered this and made another sound. Clara reached into the bassinet and put her hand against Eleanor's side and felt her breathe. The small, profound, entirely ordinary miracle of a person breathing. And she thought, I did not know I could want something this much. She had thought, in the conservation lab in Chicago a lifetime ago, when the second line appeared on the test on the steel work table beside the Flemish still life, that the wanting she felt was surprising and slightly embarrassing and should probably be examined carefully before being acted upon. She had examined it carefully. She had acted upon it. She found she had no regrets about either. In the morning, when the hospital light came gray through the window, and Eleanor had been fed and had made her assessment of breakfast and fallen back into the absolute sleep of someone with an efficient relationship to recovery, Victoria Harrington came. She knocked. She came in when Clara said to come in. She was still in the clothes she'd worn to the ballroom, but the dark dress, the small earrings, and she looked like a person at the end of a very long night, which she was. She stopped when she saw Eleanor. She looked at her for a long moment. She said, "She has his hair." Clara said, "I know." Victoria pulled the visitor's chair to the other side of the bed from Alexander, who was awake in the recliner with coffee Garrett had apparently brought at some point, and who watched Victoria with the complicated expression of two people who had been beside each other for a year without choosing each other and were now on the other side of whatever that had been. Victoria said, "My father was taken into federal custody at 2:17 this morning." Alexander said, "I know. Sue told me." Victoria said, "He didn't say anything when they came for him. He looked at me and didn't say anything." She paused. "I don't know if that means he understood or if he simply had nothing left to say to me." Clara said, "What do you need it to mean?" Victoria said, "I need it to mean he understood. That's probably convenient." Clara said, "It's human. You're allowed." Victoria looked at her. She said, "I owe you an apology for the engagement, for the year of it. I knew what you were to him. Not specifically, not at first, but I knew there was someone. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I was managing my own situation, and your situation was your situation." She looked at her hands. "That was cowardice with better manners than my father's." Clara said, "You came to Millhaven." Victoria said, "Not soon enough." Clara said, "No, but you came. And you went to that ballroom alone." Victoria said, "I wasn't alone. Your daughter was there. In the most inconvenient possible way, which I mean as a compliment." Clara almost laughed. It came out smaller than a laugh, but in the same direction. Victoria said, "What happens now?" Alexander said, "The legal process. It will take time." Victoria said, "For me." He said, "I told you the terms last night. I'll honor them." She said, "I know you will. I'm asking what happens for me personally, what I do with myself when the legal process is done, and my father's name is no longer a door that opens or a wall that closes, and I am simply a person in a city who has to decide what to be." The room was quiet. Clara said, "What do you want to be?" Victoria said, "I have no idea." Clara said, That's a better starting place than most people have. Victoria looked at Eleanor again. She said, "She's very calm." Clara said, "She's asleep." Victoria said, "Still, she has a calm quality, even asleep." She stood. She straightened her dress. She picked up her bag. She said, "I'll be in touch about the legal matters." She looked at Alexander. She said, "You should know. At the ballroom, before I went to the microphone, I looked at the room, all those people, and I thought, my father spent 14 months building a trap, and all it produced was a room full of people who found out in public that they'd been lied to. Everything he built to expand his power cost him every piece of it." She said it without satisfaction, just as an observation. She said, "I want to build something different with whatever I have left. I don't know what yet." She said goodbye and left. The room was quiet for a while. Alexander said, "She'll be all right." Clara said, "Yes, I think she will." Eleanor woke at 10 and was clear about her requirements, and Clara addressed them, and Alexander watched with the concentrated attention of a man learning something completely outside his existing knowledge base, which was exactly what he was doing. And Clara found she didn't mind being watched this time. Found, in fact, that the attention that had once felt like sunlight felt different now. Less necessary. More chosen. Not something she needed to survive, but something she'd decided was worth keeping. That distinction, she thought, was probably the whole thing. He said, watching Eleanor negotiate the world with the focused determination of the newly arrived, "She's going to be difficult." Clara said, "Probably." He said, "She already looks like she's formed opinions." Clara said, "She's 48 minutes old." He said, "Some people arrive that way." She looked at him. She said, "She is going to be exactly as difficult as she needs to be to get what she deserves. And she is going to know from the beginning that she deserves a great deal." He said, "Yes." She said, "We'll tell her the truth about everything, when she's ready for each part of it." He said, "Yes." She said, "Including the parts that don't make us look good." He said, "Yes, including those." Eleanor made a sound of assessment and then subsided. Clara looked at her daughter and thought about a painting she'd been working on the morning this all began. The mid-19th century canvas that had arrived at the Institute with its surface damage and its crude prior restorations and its 3 layers of yellowed varnish obscuring whatever was underneath. She had never gone back to it. The Institute had, according to a message Francis had sent 3 weeks ago, assigned it to another conservator. She would ask to have it reassigned. She knew what was under the surface now. She'd felt it that first afternoon, hovering her fingertips in the air above the canvas, reading the texture through the space between. Something original. Something that had survived everything that had been done to it, all the damage and the bad repairs and the years of accumulation, and was still there, waiting to be seen. That was the thing about restoration work that most people didn't understand. You didn't create what was underneath. It was already there. You just removed what was covering it. That was the thing about people too, she thought. The better version wasn't something you built from scratch. It was something you excavated, something you were patient with, something you attended to with the right tools and the right light and the willingness to do the slow, exacting, unglamorous work of removing what didn't belong. She looked at Alexander. He was looking at Eleanor with the particular expression she'd seen when he first held her, the man who had run out of distance. And there was nothing strategic in it, and nothing controlled, and nothing that served any purpose except the one it was. She said, "Alexander." He looked up. She said, "I want to go back to the Institute in 6 weeks. I want to take Eleanor with me, to the studio. Not every day? A few times. I want her to grow up understanding what the work is." He said, "Yes." She said, "And I want to teach her to bake. Not at your penthouse, at a place that's ours, that we choose together." He said, "Yes." She said, "And I want you to be present, not protective, present. There is a difference." He said, "I'm learning the difference." She said, "I know." She looked back at her daughter. "That's why I'm telling you what it looks like." Outside the hospital window, Chicago was doing what Chicago does in April. The particular aggressive optimism of a city that has survived another winter and is not going to be subtle about it. The lake was somewhere beyond the buildings, and the wind was there, and the traffic sounds were there, and all of it was ordinary and indifferent to what had happened in this room and in a ballroom and in a federal courthouse and in a bakery in Mill Haven in the long, strange span of the last 24 hours. Clara held her daughter and felt the ordinary world going on around them and found, to her own surprise, that she was glad of it. The ordinariness. The city that had nothing to do with them. The traffic moving on streets that led to places entirely unconnected to anything she'd been through. There was a whole world outside this room that was simply the world, doing its work, waiting for her to come back to it when she was ready. She would be ready. Not yet. Not today. But she would be ready, and when she was, she would walk back into it as exactly what she was. A conservator, a mother, a woman who had looked at the damage and decided it was worth addressing, who had removed 14 layers of what didn't belong and found something original underneath that had survived everything done to it. Not perfect, not unmarked, but real. Still there. She put her cheek against the top of Eleanor's head and felt the warmth of her and said nothing because there was nothing left that needed to be said. And in the hospital room in Chicago on a Thursday morning in April, with the man who had run out of distance sitting 3 feet away learning to stay still, Clara Bennett held her daughter and let the world be quiet.